You took all the risk of getting involved with the truth movement. You lost your job. You have been blacklisted from teaching colleges and universities in the United States. You think the risk was worth taking?
That's an interesting question. If you're thinking about it in terms of risk versus reward in sort of worldly terms, dunyawi, as we Muslims call it, then it's questionable. The American empire was taken over by lunatics, by people who are basically criminally insane. And the Zionist neoconservatives, of course, are specifically the people I'm talking about, but they're also they are linked to hardline imperial militarists. These 9/11 wars against countries that it should actually have been allied with if we're even just pursuing its own imperial interests. So it spent $7 or $8 trillion on these useless wars for Israel, alienated most of the world, ruined its soft power, and blackened its good name. All of this for no particular reason, except I suppose for the greater Israel pride.
Watch Federal Post. Bold and independent.
Hello, welcome to Talking Politics. I am Hassan Zafar. I'm joined by Dr. Kevin Barrett, who is based in Morocco these days. And here is Dr. Barrett's introduction. He is an Arabist, Islamologist, scholar, and one of America's best-known critics of the war on terror. From 1991 through 2006, Dr. Barrett taught at colleges and universities in San Francisco, Paris, Wisconsin. In summer 2006, Dr. Barrett was attacked by a group of Republican state legislators who called for him to be fired from his job at the University of Wisconsin-Madison due to his political opinions. Since 2007, Dr. Barrett has been informally blacklisted from teaching in American colleges and universities. He ran for Wisconsin in 2008 and currently works as a non-profit organizer, public speaker, author, and radio talk host. He lives in rural western Wisconsin with his wife, 2 sons, and a dog named after Salman Rushdie. That's your introduction, Dr. Barrett. So let's begin by talking about the early 9/11 truth movement, its rise and fall.
Yes. Well, when 9/11 happened, I was teaching an anthropology folklore class at the University of Wisconsin. And in the middle of the class, I noticed the students were looking at their cell phones and so on and distracted. I asked why, and they told me that some planes had crashed into the World Trade Center. And then shortly after that, they told me that the World Trade Center had collapsed. So I went home after that class, looked at the television, and I immediately suspected very strongly that there was more to the story than we were likely to ever be told. And my first reaction was, this will certainly benefit Israel. And that same reaction was pretty common among other Middle East studies people at the time. But I was suspicious of what I heard in the next months and even about almost 2 years. But I didn't follow it extremely closely because I was finishing my doctorate at the time. And it wasn't until the end of 2003 that I realized that there was something that we could actually prove that the official story of 9/11 as it had emerged at that point was blatantly false. I learned that because Dr. David Ray Griffin, who was a brilliant American professor who made a career out of looking for the truth, or at least trying to resolve empirical disputes, scientific disputes, and so on, was looking at this and had discovered that the whole story didn't hold up. So I looked into it, discovered that was true, was extremely shocked and upset, and soon joined the growing chorus of voices, especially at universities, questioning what we'd been told about 9/11 and pointing out that the truth could not possibly have been anything remotely close to what the media was telling us.
So you took all the risk of getting involved with the truth movement. You lost your job. You have been blacklisted from teaching in colleges and universities in the United States. You think the risk was worth taking?
That's an interesting question. If you're thinking about it in terms of risk versus reward in sort of worldly terms, dunyawi, as we Muslims call it, then it's questionable whether it would be worth it. On the positive side, I've been blessed to meet some of the very best people in the United States and indeed the world, and some of the smartest ones too. There have been all sorts of fringe benefits, I suppose, to becoming a blacklisted 9/11 truth professor. But then again, there have also been all sorts of negative consequences as well, such as being witch hunted and insulted by the media and made unemployable in Western universities. So it's kind of a toss-up in terms of the worldly effects. But I think that this goes beyond just the question of, what are we going to gain from choosing this path or that path? There's a certain level of morality and justice. If you care enough about just basic justice, there are certain kinds of acts, certain kinds of grossly immoral and unjust actions that go so far beyond what is even remotely acceptable that you can't live with yourself if you don't try to do something about it.
How has the whole narrative of war on terror affected the American society, culture, history? It's been a quarter of a century already. I think America would have been a better place to live. This had not happened.
Yes, I think the 9/11 and the war on terror that it instigated has really put the finishing touches on the American empire in a very negative way. It has hastened the American empire to an early grave, and it's done so it's by making the American empire so ugly that it's going to be cursed for the rest of human history once it falls. There's no reason why the American empire had to end this way. It could have allowed the rest of the world and the global south, especially led by China, to slowly rise, and then we could have a multipolar world and we could arrive at that process peacefully. But instead, the American empire was taken over by lunatics, by people who are basically criminally insane. And the Zionist neoconservatives, of course, are specifically the people I'm talking about, but they're also they are linked to hardline imperial militarists. So the American empire fought these 9/11 wars against countries that it should actually have been allied with if it were even just pursuing its own imperial interests. So it spent $7 or $8 trillion on these useless wars for Israel, alienated most of the world, ruined its soft power, and blackened its good name. All of this for no particular reason, except, I suppose, for the Greater Israel Project. And it's morally bankrupt, and it's financially bankrupt, and it's going down in a really disgusting way.
Yeah, we'll come to this question of Israel in a bit, but thinking of the aftermath of these attacks, the years 2002 to 2005, until these London bombings happened. And that was the time when I was studying in Glasgow. And I remember that European people at that time, they were reluctant to socialize with the American students at that time. I don't know if it was just a very limited experience that I had at that time, or was it really a widespread thing in Europe in those days? You think the events of 9/11, they affected America's relationship with Europe in any way, or Britain and American relationship?
That's an interesting question. At the beginning, I think, during the first few years after 9/11 and the U.S. invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, there was some resistance from Europe, as you suggest, not just among the students and ordinary people who've demonstrated by the millions against the unprovoked U.S. war of aggression against Iraq, which was a criminal war of aggression, and all of those people should have been prosecuted and hanged. But there was pushback from people like Jacques Chirac in France, who knew, in fact, that 9/11 had been done, of course, by the certain Americans and their Israeli friends. Thierry Meyssan wrote the biggest best-selling book for the first few weeks after its release in the history of French publishing, called L'effroyable imposture, that 9/11, the big lie was the English translation. That was published in, I think, January of 2002. And he was linked with French intelligence. And he and other people in French intelligence, as well as President Chirac, understood what was really going on. So President Chirac of France refused to go along with the U.S. attack on Iraq. And there were other forces in Europe similarly that reacted against that war. In Spain, after the false flag Madrid train bombings, the Spanish people and then government likewise resisted that war. And in terms of the London bombings, I don't know whether you were aware of the fact that those bombings were also highly questionable, to say the least. That there's all sorts of evidence that what probably really happened was that the people that were blamed were actually hired to carry backpacks in a drill, and they ended up being executed on Canary Wharf. And the bombs that blew up those trains and buses were military-grade bombs. They weren't backpacks, and they were planted beneath the trains and buses, which is why the metal floors of the trains and buses were blown upwards. So in any case, many people in the UK understood that as well. Again, a minority, but an important and intelligent minority. And so these kinds of lies have backfired against Western civilization in general and the US empire in particular. And so plenty of people in Europe have been alienated from the US empire because of these lies. The US empire, unfortunately, was able to keep pressuring Europe's leadership and getting rid of people like Chirac and others who resisted it, putting their own people in power, using their blackmail. They blackmail all of the leaders of Europe. So that, unfortunately, the neoconservative Zionist American empire has continued to control Europe since then. But I think that all of this has degraded the quality of Western civilization. It's and this, again, this is going to be a factor in, as we move to a multipolar world, the American empire and the West is going to look really bad in the view of, let's say, Chinese historians.
Yeah. And what made you suspect Israel in the first instance, as you mentioned in your opening remarks?
Well, when a crime happens, the first question that the detective asks is, cui bono? Who benefits? And in this case, you didn't have to have a master's or PhD in geopolitics to see that Israel would be the big beneficiary, because the official version of this event was a propaganda movie, really, about evil Muslim terrorists. And Israel, in particular, the neoconservative Zionist Likud faction, led by Netanyahu and at the time Ariel Sharon, had been working for 2 decades to try to convince the West in general and the American leaders in particular to transition after the Cold War into a so-called war on terror. And terrorism they were going to equate with Muslims, and specifically with Palestinians. And they were going to hijack the West in their war for greater Israel, because they understand that they need to keep murdering and expelling not just Palestinians, but ultimately Jordanians, Egyptians, Syrians, Lebanese, and even some Saudis and possibly Turks if they're going to capture their biblical greater Israel, which is everything between the Nile and the Euphrates. So they have a very difficult project, and they're stooping to all sorts of unethical, indeed psychopathic means to try to achieve that project. And it's been clear for a long time that the Israelis manipulate American policy. They are suspected of killing American presidents, John F. Kennedy in particular, and his brother Robert. They attempted to kill George W. Bush, H.W. Bush, I'm sorry, in 1990, and so on and so forth. So just based on the historical situation with Israel needing to bring the West and the Americans into their war against Muslims and Palestinians, that 9/11 was exactly what they needed and what they wanted.
Yeah, well, if you allow me to ask one question, frankly, is this about Muslims, or is this about being an American, as an American feeling about Israeli and Zionist interference in American affairs? What bothers you most?
In my case, there's some of both. I'm very angry as being a Muslim who then was forced to be bringing up small children after 9/11. And then those small children, as they grew up, my sons were born in 1994 and 1997. So they grew up with this hatred of Islam and Muslims in America that had been created by this publicity stunt on 9/11. And so being a Muslim, I got to experience that firsthand. But also as an American, I've always, since I was 15, I have been alienated from the American mainstream and kind of, frankly, angry and disgusted and depressed and so on, because I learned that the JFK assassination was another coup d'etat that the American people were too cowardly to face. I learned that in about 1975 when I was in high school. And so 9/11 was yet another blow to my self-esteem as an American. Here's my own country that I'm taught to believe is sort of the best country in the world, the most powerful country in the world, the most honorable country in the world, and so on. And there are a lot of good things about it. But it's too cowardly to face the reality of these kinds of events. When the president of the United States has his brains blown out, and then the alleged assassin is murdered in a police station on live television by a Jewish mafia assassin who walks through a crowd of Dallas police officers who step aside on live television. That is so outrageous that no decent person can accept being a member of a society that operates like that and that allows this sort of thing to happen without standing up against it.
Yeah, well, reasons for suspecting Israel's part. Do we have a proof? Do we have any proof that they were involved?
We're talking about the JFK assassination now.
I'm talking about 9/11.
Oh,
and
9/11,
Israel.
okay.
Yes.
Yeah, well, actually, we have plenty of evidence on both. Regarding 9/11, where do we start with the evidence? Well, first, the smoking gun of 9/11 is the controlled demolition of Building 7. Building 7 was the third tower, 47 stories tall, and it collapsed at 5:23 in the afternoon on September 11th, 2001, straight down into its own footprint at near free fall acceleration. In fact, complete free fall for the first 2.5 seconds. And that demolition, that obvious demolition, which the witnesses even heard a countdown to demolition, 10, 9, 8, 3, 2, 1, on police radio, or what they thought was police radio. And the overinsured landlord of 2 months, the man who had bought the whole World Trade Center 2 months before 9/11, a fellow named Larry Silverstein, who was a reputed organized crime figure in New York, who got his start in sex trafficking, pornography, and strip clubs, and parlayed that into a real estate empire. He's the man who bought the entire World Trade Center 2 months before 9/11. And at a time when it was condemned for asbestos, it would have required billions of dollars to remove the asbestos from the steel frame members. Well, Mr. Silverstein got that. He was given the contract to buy the building, buy the whole World Trade Center complex, and he didn't even give the lowest bid or the highest bid. And then he doubled the existing anti-terrorism insurance and changed the payout terms to cash. All of this 2 months before 9/11. Now, Larry Silverstein is not only a Jewish organized crime figure of the highest order, but he's also a close friend of Benjamin Netanyahu. According to Haaretz, the leading newspaper in Israel, Silverstein and Netanyahu are on the phone with each other every single weekend. They have a conversation. They are close friends. So it's very interesting that a close friend of Benjamin Netanyahu, organized crime figure, buys this white elephant building that's condemned for asbestos 2 months before it gets blown up. And then he managed to collect even more cash because he claimed that there were two separate...
You're saying from that building, the entire operation was carried out for bringing the Twin Towers down?
Well, actually, I'm not sure about that. But the reason that Building 7 is the smoking gun of 9/11 is that it is such a clear and obvious case of controlled demolition. The official story says that it just fell down because of some office fires that broke out after the Twin Towers had collapsed that morning and started fires in Building 7. But the reality is that it's clear, anybody who looks at it can see that it's coming straight down like an elevator straight into the earth, that it's a classic controlled demolition. And there's all sorts of evidence supporting that. So once we see that, then we look at the Twin Towers, and then we see the same problem. The difference being that when they blew up the Twin Towers, they did it in such a way that the first explosion happened up at the level 3/4 of the way up the building, about where the planes hit, so that they could then claim that the building fell down because of damage, or partly because of damage from the plane. But the thing about Building 7 is that clearly the official story about it is such an obvious lie that it took NIST, the American government body tasked with investigating it and reporting on it, I think it was 7 years, as I recall, to come out with their ridiculous report, which was immediately proven false. So Larry Silverstein, the man who, again, bought the entire trade center right before this happened and doubled the insurance, and then doubled that again by claiming it was two separate terrorist attacks, the two planes. That man was not only a close friend of Netanyahu, but he also confessed on American television that he was party to the decision to demolish Building 7. So the evidence about this Building 7 is just so strong that everyone who looks at it, including Senator Ron Johnson...
A strong connection there. We can see a kind of strong connection there. How many Americans buy this story now, today? The official story and the story that you are telling, the whistleblowers are telling. Where do you think the American people stand now?
They haven't taken so many polls recently, but the polls early on showed that from 2001 through 2006 or 7, the number of people doubting the official story grew until, I believe, one poll, a Scripps poll in I think 2007, showed that 37% of Americans thought that it was either likely or very likely that 9/11 was a false flag designed to trigger American wars in the Middle East. That was 37%. That was approaching half. And of the people who strongly believed the official story, it was actually less than that. It was perhaps 25%, and most Americans were sort of in the middle. Now, it may have declined a bit since then, but I think we're still in the area of about 1/4 of Americans strongly doubt the official story, or maybe even kind of know the truth about it. And then another 25% just automatically believe the official story. And the majority of Americans are somewhere in between, not quite knowing what to believe.
What is the significance of the truth if it comes out now? Because we see the official stories being endorsed by consistent film productions. We recently had a 9/11 story on Netflix, which in a way may suggest that this story still holds some importance in the minds of the American establishment or the Israeli establishment, if you like to connect them both.
Yes, I think it does. I think in particular, right at this moment, we're in a situation regarding the genocide in Gaza that's somewhat parallel to the situation that we were in during the first 5 years after 9/11. That is, that the people who are paying attention can see the lies coming from the Israeli side and the American side. They can see the lies, they can see the horror, and they're very alienated from the kind of official media narrative. And especially the young people now are ahead of the older generation. All the polls show that among younger Americans, that sympathy for Palestine has now eclipsed sympathy for Israel. So given that situation, I think that the people who now understand the utter depravity of the leaders of Israel and to some extent the American empire that supports it are ready to open their minds to realities concerning more other depraved crimes. And 9/11, which murdered almost 3,000 people in one morning in order to facilitate the murder of many, many millions more, is certainly one of the worst crimes ever committed in history. And as people understand the horror of the genocide of Gaza, they may also be able to open their minds to understand the horror of 9/11 that actually made that genocide possible, that there would never be.
So this is suggesting that the 9/11 paved the way for what is happening in Gaza today.
Absolutely. It demonized Muslims. It demonized enemies of Israel and its American backers. And they're playing the same script. Just as after 9/11, they demonized bin Laden and the supposed radical Muslim hijackers so they could demonize Muslims in general and any Muslims who resist American or Israeli oppression in particular. And that demonization of Muslims was used to brainwash the world into accepting these criminal wars of aggression. Well, now they're playing the same script. They're claiming Hamas is, these evil Muslim terrorists, just the same thing they claimed about the alleged 9/11 hijackers. Now, the difference, of course, is that there weren't any Muslim hijackers on any planes on 9/11. And 9/11 was not there was essentially no Muslim involvement whatsoever, except as patsies. However, in the case of October 7th in Israel, 2023, clearly Hamas did manage to escape from their concentration camp and inflict a serious blow on their tormentors in Israel. But the lies are almost as big as the lies about 9/11. And they tell the West, in the media, they tell the West that Hamas roasted babies. They beheaded babies and they roasted them in ovens and they committed rapes and this and that. They invented all sorts of crazy lies about Hamas. And they lied and blamed the Israeli deaths on Hamas when, in fact, clearly the majority of the civilians who died on October 7th, 2023, were killed by Israeli forces, not by Hamas. We now know, and Israel has even admitted, that they invoked the Hannibal Directive, which directs them to kill all hostages and hostage takers to prevent the strategic liability of hostages. So they're lying about that. And the same kinds of lies are enabling the genocide of Gaza, just as the lies about 9/11 have enabled all these wars against Middle Eastern countries.
Do we have reasons to believe that 7th of October was a false flag too?
I don't think it was a false flag in the same way that 9/11 was. 9/11 was essentially purely an Israeli-American operation. And I say Israeli first because I think Israel was the prime instigator, but I think they had help from highly placed operatives in the United States. But as I said, there were essentially no real Muslim terrorists involved in any way in 9/11. And indeed, Osama bin Laden repeatedly denied and deplored 9/11 even. In September and October of 2001, Osama bin Laden was interviewed 3 times by Al Jazeera. And in the first 2 times, he said very clearly that, I had
Pakistani channel too.
Right. Yes, he said I had nothing to do with this. And the third time, though, was after in October, the U.S. had invaded Afghanistan, and bin Laden was angry enough that he said something like, well, maybe I didn't do it, but I almost wish I had, or something like that. But in any case, it's clear that this was not an al-Qaeda operation in the sense that there's really an al-Qaeda. However, with October 7th, 2023, Hamas clearly did execute a very skillfully planned military operation that put Israel in a difficult position. Israel had to either essentially take a huge blow, or they could gamble and try to accelerate their genocide and try to push Palestinians out of Gaza and to some extent the West Bank. And that's what they've chosen to do, but that is undermining their long-term legitimacy. So strategically, October 7th was actually, even though the Palestinians have suffered enormously, October 7th was strategically a master stroke of genius from the Palestinian side, not from the Israeli side. So for that reason, the who benefits reason, I don't think that it would have been fully and completely planned by Israel in the way that 9/11 was. But I do think it's conceivable that elements of the Israeli government did know something was coming, choose to look the other way, and perhaps even...
Yeah, because the kind of intelligence failure is involved, barbed wires, walls, cameras, and nobody knew what was happening for several hours. Quite astonishing, isn't it?
Right. So the words we used to use in the 9/11 Truth Movement, we had these acronyms of LIHOP, which is let it happen on purpose, and then MIHOP, made it happen on purpose. And
you let it do it while you look away for a while, and then you can come back.
Right. And that, yes, not September, or rather October 7th, 2023 might have been allowed to happen to some extent in that way. I'm not 100% convinced. Yeah.
Seems so. At least we have reasons to suspect, if not believe. And the same kind of series of false flags we have witnessed in India, for example, starting right after 9/11 down to the recent one, 22nd of April in Pahalgam, after which India carried out strikes in Pakistan. So, because it seemed absolutely ridiculous, the whole idea that in order to liberate Kashmir, Pakistani army or Pakistani state agencies would carry out or even facilitate this kind of attacks in Mumbai or attacks on Indian parliament. How would it really further the cause of the Kashmiris? Makes no sense at all.
Absolutely. I agree. In fact, there's been a lot of work done in English, or some work at least, on the Mumbai attacks of, was it 2008, the big one?
2008.
Yes.
How could an attack on in Mumbai help Kashmiris? Is there any connection?
Exactly. Yes, there's a book. One of the
Pakistani forces are so naive that they wouldn't know the kind of fallout it could have. And how could it help the Kashmiris? How could it free Kashmir, for example?
Right. So, that's right. And there's a similar argument about 9/11. That is that there's no reason why real anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist Muslims would try to carry out such a huge attack in New York, because it wouldn't help their cause. It would have precisely the opposite effect. Just like the Vietnamese in 1968 would not try to blow up New York, Muslims would not try to blow up New York either. That's so you're absolutely right. And with regard to Mumbai,
in the beginning, we have to see who actually benefited from it.
Exactly.
Did Pakistan benefit from the Mumbai attacks or the attacks on Indian Parliament in any way? I mean, how did we benefit from it? Apart from looking back to the world.
You know, one of my 9/11 Truth colleagues, a man named Elias Davidson, who was born in occupied Palestine, he's Jewish, and he left. He and his family left because they couldn't stand to be part of that genocidal occupation. And he ended up working in the 9/11 Truth movement. He wrote a very large book. I think it's 400 or 500 pages, maybe more actually, on the 2008 Mumbai attacks, showing that clearly that was a false flag.
So two more things here. JFK case, you partially mentioned that there was some Israeli involvement in that too. And Pearl Harbor, which Barbara drew some parallel between Pearl Harbor and 9/11. If you'd like to talk about these things.
Sure, yeah. I think the JFK case it's an interesting one because, as I said, I discovered the problem with the official story of the JFK assassination when I was in high school, and it powerfully affected my life. I could never feel the same way about America after I learned that, and I learned how obvious it was, and how people hadn't been upset enough to do anything about it. And the JFK truth movement grew slowly over the decades, and by the early 1990s, about 2/3 of Americans, according to the polls, knew that it had been some kind of coup d'etat and that the CIA was the leading suspect. Well, as it turns out, the blame the CIA movement was probably directed by the partisans of Israel. And during the early stages, these earlier, first decades of the JFK truth movement, hardly anybody talked about Israel. Finally there was one book written, was it 1990s, I think, by Michael Collins Piper, called Final Judgment, that made the argument that, in fact, there's a lot of evidence pointing to Israel as the main culprit behind the JFK assassination. And that book was blacklisted. Michael Collins Piper was probably murdered. And for a long time, nobody knew about this. Everybody knew that the JFK assassination was a coup d'etat, but nobody realized that it was probably the Israelis and their American friends behind it. But slowly that has been filtering out thanks to the internet. And today, I think that there is a very large community of people who understand this, and even some fairly mainstream people like Max Blumenthal and I think Judge Napolitano, people with big audiences, have talked about this and alluded to it. And the motive, of course, was that President Kennedy was planning to shut down Israel's nuclear program. And in Israel, the leadership, starting with Ben-Gurion, believed that having nuclear weapons was absolutely essential to Israel's security. So that conflict led Ben-Gurion to resign in the spring of 1963, and then he disappeared from public view, quite possibly to organize the American coup. And they removed that problem. And President Johnson, who replaced President Kennedy, was a huge supporter of Israel, who looked the other way as Israelis came to America, stole American nuclear weapons and material, took it to Israel, and built their arsenal of 400 or so nuclear weapons.
Yeah, so that's the reason to suspect Israel's involvement. And the only footage that was available of the assassination, this bystander, I forgot his name, he comes he comes to the spot, and then he realizes that he still has time. He goes back home, collects his camera, brings it back, positions it right there where this whole episode could be filmed. And I don't know, he sold it for how many $1 million to the American channel afterwards.
It's actually worse than that. It's true that Zapruder, the 33rd degree Freemason and pillar of the Jewish establishment in Dallas, who took that film,
Yes.
did everything you just said.
Yes. It was a 16 millimeter camera. I remember the details partially, yes.
Right. But what was amazing was that the film was altered, apparently. It ended up being sold to Life magazine, and Life magazine printed the relevant frames showing the president's head being hit by bullets. But when they printed those frames in their magazine, they printed them backwards. So it looked as though the president's head was snapping forwards as he was hit, when in reality it was snapping backwards. Now, why would they do that? Why would America's biggest magazine, Life magazine, which was connected to the CIA, which had bought that movie from Zapruder, why would they print those frames backwards? And that was the thing more than anything. When I first learned about this problem when I was in high school, was when a man named Mark Lane, who was the original JFK truth activist and attorney, gave a lecture. And I watched his lecture. I saw the shot. He had a slideshow, and he showed the Life magazine picture of the frames of the Zapruder film. And then he showed us the actual Zapruder film, which he'd managed to get a hold of. And I couldn't believe that the magazine would print those frames backwards to make you think that the shot came from behind. And I thought, could that possibly be some kind of mistake? I even called up some photography and film experts and said, can you explain this?
It could distract the investigators, because if he's ducking down, means the bullet came from behind.
Yes, the bullet.
Right. The bullet comes from the front.
Yeah, right. The bullet had momentum, so the bullet would push the head in the direction that it hit. Yes.
So it really changes the direction of the bullet 360 degrees, well, 180 degrees. Yes.
Right, and in fact, they probably altered what we have now of the Zapruder film. Probably is not actually what the camera captured. It's probably been altered. But even what we have makes it totally clear that the shot had to have come from the front, and it had to have been a frangible bullet, meaning that it exploded on impact and essentially blew the president's brains out the back of his head. And in fact, his wife was reaching behind him, trying to pick up pieces of his skull and brains that had been blown backwards. It's just unimaginable that they would do that in broad daylight and film it. And then
well, I read the day of the Jackal, if you remember that story, assassination attempt at the French president. That kind of clean shot could not have been taken with an ordinary gun. It has to be a custom-made rifle to carry out that kind of thing.
Right.
So,
it was a military operation with professional military gear, including rifles. And yes, then they tried to blame it on Lee Harvey Oswald, who was not a very good shot. And they claimed he did it with a Mannlicher Carcano rifle, which is a very bad rifle, a notoriously inaccurate rifle. Some of the world's best marksmen tried to replicate that supposed feat of shooting, and nobody could do it. So it was really an implausible cover story. And the more, it's like 9/11, the more one looks at this, the more one is shocked that these people were able to get away with such a brazen crime.
So what we are saying, that there are so many inconsistencies, so many inaccuracies in all these stories, which make the doubt really plausible.
Yeah, well, I think it's beyond that. I think that that's true with many stories. There are all sorts of issues where there's reasonable doubt. But here, this is beyond reasonable doubt. With the JFK assassination and with 9/11, the criminals who did these coups in America did them deliberately, I think, did them in such a way that they didn't even try to hide what they were doing. And they depended on their control of the media and the fact that the crimes were so outrageous that people would be afraid to see what was in front of them. So I think it's way beyond reasonable doubt. I think that both with JFK and even more so with 9/11, starting with Building 7, that these crimes are clear and obvious and brazen, and there isn't any doubt.
Clumsy, we like to say, clumsy, because yeah, if you care less about how it will look in the aftermath, only then you can be so careless about such details.
Right. And I think part of the reason that they're able to do these crimes in such careless, seemingly sloppy ways is that they know that the media will cover for them. And the reason for that,
Exactly. When
yes.
you have the media on your side, you're able to tell the story, and you can continue to tell that story for decades to come, just like we just had a 9/11 film on Netflix, reinforcing the official narrative one more time.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
Absolutely. And we're not supposed to talk about the ethnic composition of the media, but the fact is that, well, Philip Weiss, a former New York Times journalist, wrote a wonderful article called "Do Jews Dominate American Media? And So What If We Do?" And in that article, Philip Weiss, who is Jewish himself, describes his history working with the New York Times and other major media outlets, and says that more than half of the important decision makers, including editors, fellow high-level journalists, and his bosses and owners, were Jewish. And then he answers his own question, well, does this matter? And the answer is yes, because Jewish people in America are brought up to feel that they're in danger. The Jews are in danger everywhere, and they have to rally together to prevent the danger from overcoming them. And because the media is overwhelmingly dominated by Jewish people, as Philip Weiss writes, that I think that when Israel murders an American president or conducts a false flag event like 9/11, it knows that the Jews who dominate American media, even though they're not evil, they're not purposely conspiring, but those Jews are terrified that Israel might be exposed, that they might get caught. And if that happens, it might be terrible for Jewish Americans and Jews everywhere in the world. So even Jews who don't like Israel may cover up for these kinds of crimes because they're so terrified of what might happen. And some of this, I think, is even unconscious. I don't think they stop and think about it. I think it's just a given. It's part of their makeup. And so when President Nixon and Billy Graham talked about Jews owning the media and that this was a terrible thing, I think they were right, but maybe not for all the reasons that they believed.
Let's jump to the president for a second. Mm-hmm. Why do you think the Trump administration is all of a sudden interested in reopening the JFK case, coming down hard on CIA, closing down U.S. aid, AID?
Yes, these are all seemingly sort of separate issues, but I suppose that they could be linked to some extent with the Trump's people are trying to purge the opposition. And there's a very brutal political war going on in the United States now between the pro-Trump and the anti-Trump forces. And the pro-Trump forces are trying to purge the anti-Trump forces before it happened, before they get purged themselves. And so I think that in order to take advantage of the public mistrust of the so-called deep state and allow Trump and his people to get rid of all the people against them, that they're using this issue of the JFK case and these other cases to create, create this idea among their supporters that there is an anti-Trump deep state that has to be purged. I don't think that Trump's people sincerely are trying to expose the JFK assassination, because I think Trump is largely controlled by the same, the Jewish mafia that's loyal to Israel. And so I don't think that Trump's people want the truth about that to come out or want the truth about 9/11 to come out. As far as the issue of closing down USAID, I think that they clearly are not interested in soft power. They're willing to completely give up American soft power and resort to purely hard power for the next phase of the American empire's attempt to keep itself going. And I think that's a pretty stupid move, frankly, but I'm not surprised.
Yeah. So where do we stand today in relation to the truth about 9/11? And yes, the question about the Arab involvement, if you'd like to talk about it. The involvement of these 15 Saudi hijackers, and as Carl mentioned, one Kuwaiti royal family member who was also the ambassador to the United States, who orchestrated, according to him, he orchestrated the entire Desert Storm with the Americans. What is the involvement of the Arabs in all of this?
Well, I think that the reason that 15 out of the 19 alleged hijackers were Saudis is because the people who arranged 9/11, and I believe that those people would be primarily loyal to Israel and probably included some people in the American government as well. I think those people realized that they needed to prevent Saudi Arabia from going its own way. And in August of 2001, the King of Saudi Arabia had announced that Saudi Arabia was leaving the American empire because the people of the region would no longer accept American support of Israel. So he called it the parting of the ways. And it wasn't just the king. There are a number of high-level people in Saudi Arabia at that time were ready to do that. And then 9/11 happened. And 15 of the alleged hijackers were Saudis. And that meant that there was an implicit threat. The minute that the American president said that Saudi Arabia did this, and look at these 15 Saudi hijackers, the Americans could credibly threaten to drop nuclear weapons on Riyadh and Mecca and everything else. So now suddenly Saudi Arabia was exposed to the Israeli-American power, and there was a purge. And a number of these independent Saudi people suddenly got killed. They were, died of thirst in the desert and things like that. So there was a purge. The anti-American, patriotic, pro-Arabian, pro-Muslim, pro-Palestine Saudi people were slaughtered, butchered, and thrown out of power. And a gun was put to the head of the leadership in Saudi Arabia. Same thing in Pakistan, by the way. Then President Musharraf famously said that Bush called him up and threatened him and said that if you don't do everything I tell you, we're going to bomb Pakistan back to the Stone Age. That's a direct quote from President Musharraf. So 9/11 was designed to let the Israelis use the Americans to threaten countries like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and prevent them from rallying to the defense of Palestine and the Muslim people.
Do you think the man who died in Abbottabad was Osama bin Laden?
I'm still not sure what really happened with the alleged killing of bin Laden. One thing I'm sure of, though, is that the official story is a preposterous lie. Seymour Hersh, America's leading investigative journalist, has written extensively on this issue and shown that whatever the truth is, it's not what they're telling us. You may have a better idea than I do, because I'm still confused about what really happened there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kevin Barrett, for sharing your thoughts and your knowledge with us. And I wish you all the best, that you can go back to the United States one day and find a teaching job there in a college or a university, and this ban on you is lifted. And thank you very much for watching. Take care of yourself. Khuda Hafiz. Pakistan Zindabad.